matters. Now, the topic for today is glucagon-like peptide 1 or GLP-1. And it's got an amazing role in enhancing insulin secretion, very critical. It can reduce appetite, weight control, and things like that. And so it's critical to us who are in the lifestyle changing business. Now, this is just one of a number of studies that are focusing on the effect of GLP-1, and that is the role that's being played by this peptide in the treatment of diabetes and weight control. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Aron, our science chief, and take it away.
Well, thanks, Reed. So as I always say, in each of these sessions, we take a deep dive into recent research that brings to light objective scientific evidence on the topic at hand, the topic we're dealing with. So in this case, let's look more closely, as Reed said, a very important topic, glucagon-like peptide 1, GLP-1, and its role in enhancing insulin secretion, reducing appetite, and weight control. Wow, that's a big one. GLP-1 has been used for the treatment of diabetes, but recently it has become a sensation, to say the least, as a treatment for weight loss. So let's look at the actual evidence, because science matters.
Fantastic. So before we go on with today's topic, I want to bring up that last week in our discussion of hearing loss and increased risk of dementia was a great episode. If you haven't heard it, go back. They're all in the archives. Well, we received several questions, and one of which, Dr. Gonshor, I hope you'll indulge us, is that are dementia and cognitive decline the only conditions linked with hearing loss?
It's a good question. No, they're not. And in fact, there are a multitude of studies that clearly indicate that about half of the adults that get tested, 70 years and older, have a hearing loss that impacts their daily communication. That's clear. And because hearing loss makes it more difficult to interact with their peers, it can lead, as I mentioned in that broadcast, to decreased social engagement. It involves anxiety and ultimately clinical depression. And that's important, clinical depression. A number of studies have specifically highlighted that the regular use of hearing aids is associated with a lower prevalence of depression, often within 3 months of hearing aid use. That's really remarkable. So many of you are probably aware that in the United States, or at least a good number of the states, I don't know if it's all over, but I know that a good number of them, you can now buy over-the-counter hearing aids in person at a store or through an online retailer without the need for a medical exam or a prescription or even a fitting adjustment by an audiologist. Let me make it clear. I think it is important to have an audiologist look at you. It is important to get them properly fitted, etc. But one of the biggest issues has been a lot of people have not been getting their hearing aids because they're too expensive. And I can tell you some of the good ones are in the thousands. You can now get hearing aids, and I checked into this, literally for a couple of $100s. May not be with all the bells and whistles and so on, but I'll tell you, it enhances hearing. And so this has been, it's just started, I believe, Reed, you may know, it's just the last month or two that they've actually instituted that through all of the main chains, the CVS's and Walgreens and et cetera, throughout, throughout the country. And that is going to make a very, very significant change.
Well, fantastic. The reason we do this is to help people. Dr. Gonshor and I are not here to toot our own horns, but we want this information to be used by our followers and our practitioners and anyone who's interested to get better, to increase your happiness through better health. And so I want to just add that you can get a free hearing test just about any audiologist, or there's physicians that, of course, specialize in hearing. And really, it should be done at Costco. They have free eye exams. Why don't they have free hearing exam? And maybe they even do, or are they, you can get them, like you said, at the Walgreens. And CVS and these places. So fantastic. And thank everyone for submitting their questions. They're very important as we learn together. Now, Dr. Gonshor, I want you to take it away. We jump into today's study about GLP-1 and its role in enhancing insulin secretion, reducing appetite, and weight control.
Well, thank you, everyone. And today, as Reed has said, we are discussing GLP-1 and its role in enhancing insulin secretion, reducing appetite, and weight control. Aha, weight control. There's an interesting one. And what I have actually done here,
there we go,
is to show two studies. This is not something we do very often, but I think here it is important, because originally I was going to talk about this first study, which has to do with allulose, a rare sugar, and comparing various aspects of insulin function and so on in a randomized controlled trial. But when I was doing this, I began to realize that the real story wasn't really allulose, although that's interesting, but it really has to do with what allulose is actually doing in the body, and that had to do with GLP-1. So I've included another study, which is, of course, turns out to be fundamentally much more important in many ways, and that is really looking at GLP-1 itself. And so the findings of the first study suggested that allulose, when it's added to sucrose, the regular sugar, attenuated both postprandial, meaning after a meal, glucose and insulin responses. Quite interesting. But here we go. Allulose, it turns out, interacts with GLP-1. And we're going to continue talking about this over the next few minutes. You're going to hear a lot. It's a hormone mainly secreted by three tissues in the human body. The enteroendocrine cells in the distal intestine. And for those who are involved in intestinal function, you know about the endocrine cells there. The alpha cells in the pancreas, not the beta cells, but the alpha cells in the pancreas, and the central nervous system as well. And that's important. So GLP-1 is interacting in the central nervous system. And through its interactions with a GLP-1 receptor, this particular hormone, GLP-1, participates in the regulation of glucose homeostasis. So that's really quite something. So let's at least discuss allulose for a few moments. Allulose is a rare sugar, and we know that it increases GLP-1 secretion. And GLP-1 is a satiatory hormone, meaning it's a hormone that tells you when you've had enough eating, when you're full. And the second thing that it does is that it enhances the activity of the receptors which will receive and bond with the GLP-1. And so allulose has the following properties. It's anti-hyperglycemic, reduces the risk of metabolic syndrome, which is important in and of itself because of this rare sugar, allulose's ability to increase fat oxidation and to decrease fat synthesis, so that you're decreasing the ability of that person to get fat. It has antioxidant properties, never hurts. And it reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease. How? By decreasing the levels of total cholesterol, of the triglycerides, and specifically within the total cholesterol, it decreases LDL type. And LDL is low density lipopolysaccharide. That's been traditionally called the bad cholesterol. Whether it really is not critical here. And at the same time, it increases the HDL, the high density, which is the good cholesterol. But the important thing is a GLP-1, because the study showed that this GLP-1, a hormone, which, as I said, is secreted in the small intestine and actually in the colon as well, in response to taking in nutrients, has a number of very important physiological roles. It enhances insulin secretion. which of course is one of the ways of decreasing diabetes. But interestingly enough, it also slows gastric emptying and reduces appetite. Keep that in mind. And thereby, it plays a crucial role in blood glucose control. So all of that helps explain, and I'm going to go into this in much greater detail in a few moments, why GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic, and here I've said it for the first time, I'm going to continue saying it, are effective in weight loss management. So let's repeat. GLP-1, it's a secretory gut-derived peptide hormone. It rapidly is secreted in response to a meal. You eat, it gets secreted, interacts with receptors, the GLP-1 receptors, which are widely distributed in the pancreas and other tissue cells. And remember, one of those areas is the brain. It stimulates both pancreatic alpha and beta cells postprandially after a meal to secrete insulin. So GLP-1 receptor agonists, that means certain entities which we can create as drugs that act on GLP-1 receptors. These represent a class of medications that can activate the GLP-1 receptor and therefore can treat diabetes type 2 and in some cases obesity. So a lot of these drugs that are being used for obesity control today were actually developed to control diabetes. An example of that is the exenatides and of course the semaglutides, which includes Ozempic. So GLP-1, to repeat, has multiple biological effects. What does it do? Well, one of the things, interestingly enough, is reduces neuroinflammation. Very important. Promotes nerve growth. It improves heart function. And here we go. It suppresses appetite. It delays gastric emptying. It regulates blood lipid metabolism and reduces fat deposition. All extremely important when you're looking at metabolic function. So these GLP-1 agonists, these drugs that act like GLP-1, what do? Well, we now know that they can be used in weight management, specifically one of the semaglutides, which is FDA approved for this, which is Wegovy. Interesting enough, Ozempic, let me repeat, Ozempic is not FDA approved for weight control. It's approved for diabetes, but it's being used in massive amounts off-label. The other thing that these GLP-1 agonists do, they work in the vascular endothelial cells, so they're important in cardiovascular disease management. They can be neuroprotective, and in addition to playing a role in the treatment of diabetes, these agonists can also be used in treating other diseases, including, as it turns out, certain neurological diseases and other cardiovascular diseases, and of course, diseases that are related to metabolic disorders like diabetes and the issue of weight. And this is a very busy slide, but at the end of the day, what am I saying? These GLP agonists have positive therapeutic effects where on the brain, the pancreas, the heart, the GI tract, and the liver. Not bad for one group of hormones. In the liver, decreases glucose production and liver fat content, etc. In the pancreas, what does it do? Increases insulin synthesis and secretion, and by doing that, decreases blood glucose. In the brain, decreases neuroinflammation and increases the signaling level of satiety, meaning I'm full, I don't need to eat anymore. That's extremely important. And in the GI tract, what does it do? It decreases gastric emptying and peristalsis, meaning how quickly does food move through the gastrointestinal tract. So what are the key takeaways here? Overall, The GLP-1 agonists, these drugs that act like GLP-1, are considered as very novel blood glucose lowering drugs. That's what they were developed for, to treat diabetes, owing to their advantages of lowering blood pressure, fasting blood glucose, and HbA1c. But the GLP-1 agonists also induce weight loss and are associated with a low incidence of hypoglycemia. So that makes GLP-1 agonists very valuable in the treatment and the prevention of diseases of the nervous and cardiovascular system, very important, endocrine disorders like diabetes, or metabolic diseases due to their neuroprotective, cardiovascular protective, and metabolic regulatory effects. Those are a lot of words, but what it's saying to you is it has some very dramatic overall effects in the body. But there is a caveat. There are actually many caveats, but one of these needs to be stated. One role, as I said, of the GLP-1 is to slow food passage through the stomach, which helps people feel fuller for a longer period of time. However, if the stomach slows too much, it can cause problems such as a devastating one, which is called gastroparesis or stomach paralysis. It's idiopathic, meaning we don't know what causes it, and unfortunately, it's incurable. It's exacerbated by these GLP-1 medications such as the semaglutides like Ozempic, Wegovy, which you hear a lot about today. The other thing it causes, besides gastroparesis, is cyclic vomiting syndrome. These poor people who have this are throwing up violently multiple times a day. So these extreme and unrelenting cases are believed to be very rare. It's about 10 men or 40 women per 100,000. And it may be the result of the drug actually unmasking or worsening an existing slow stomach condition, as it used to be called, which is a silent condition. It's called delayed gastric emptying. And the individual may not even know they have it. So gastroparesis, thank God it's rare, can have many causes, including diabetes, interestingly enough. And it's a reason why many people are on these particular GLP-1 agonist drugs in the first place. So I say this as a caveat. People need to pay attention to these side effects. If you vomit once or twice, might be normal, but if persistent vomiting is going on, it's not normal. And gastroparesis may be one of the issues. You should get evaluated, and you consider reducing the dose of this drug or frankly stopping this medication. And that is all for this particular session.
Well, thanks for that expose, Dr. Gonshor. And I think it's important for FDNs and other listeners to realize that the difference here. So we talked about GLP-1, which you can actually get, your body produces it in 3 different areas, as Dr. Gonshor mentioned. A good, healthy gut is a good way to get GLP-1 production up. That's an important peptide that helps us to control our blood sugar, and it naturally makes you feel fuller so that you're not going to overeat, and can help with your weight, not only blood sugar, but weight loss. Now, he mentioned allulose, which is in certain foods. It's a type of sweetener that's in foods. It's in figs, and you can look it up. It's in a lot of other things. I just had it on my screen here. But it's also available commercially as an artificial sweetener. It's 0 calories, which we would think would be nice. But other 0 calorie sweeteners can still increase insulin. They kind of fake out the pancreas, and that's the problem with them. I personally just did an experiment. I had my glucose monitor on, and you want to get your constant glucose monitor if you're having these kind of issues, or you like to learn more about yourself. So you get your GCM and you experiment with some of these things. If you used allulose as your sweetener, you would not get a spike in insulin, and your blood sugar would stay very stable. Unlike some other artificial sweeteners, and I drank a can of something, it was Zevia, I think, and it didn't raise my blood sugar because it has no sugar in it, but it increased my insulin because it tricked out the beta cells in my pancreas. So insulin went up. And what did that do? It drove my blood sugar down, even though it wasn't, higher at the time. Therefore, what? I felt like crap. I felt hypoglycemic. So allulose is actually may become one of my favorite sweeteners that doesn't raise calories at all because of that factor. So I think studying GLP-1 is a very important concept. The other thing that Dr. Gonshor brought in today was the GLP-1 receptor and agonist, which is a medication, which again is kind of a trick that gets your pancreas to behave in a way that's going to stabilize blood sugar, even lead to weight loss in some cases. And as you mentioned, that medication is being used off-label for weight control. Now, as people, most FDNs can't prescribe drugs and would prefer not to if they can help it. And so I think it's really important to get into the discussion at a very deep level and understand that it's GLP-1 we want, and not just to trick the receptors. And then there's natural ways to use 0-calorie sweeteners like allulose that you'll get all the benefits of a good, healthy insulin response without actually adding to your blood sugar. So lots to discuss here. And Dr. Gonshor, I want to thank you again for the takeaways. And let me just look here. What are some of the things I want to say? Well, definitely, if you like us or if you enjoyed today's episode, we want to like and share, spread the good word. If you want to contribute something, you can get your questions or comments answered at FDN training / what is it again?
It's
FDN training
matters.
FDNtraining.com/science matters. And you can find all the studies that we use at fdntraining.com/studies. So until next week or 2 weeks from now, good luck, God bless, and I hope you enjoyed today's broadcast. Thank you, Dr. Gonshor.
Thank you.
And the reason we do it?
Because science matters.